At this point, I would like to call on our first speaker, Brendon Samuels. Brendon's a PhD candidate in the Department of Biology at Western University. Brendon is particularly interested in avian research and in measures to protect birds. He's a coordinator of Bird Friendly London. He also is chair of the City of London Environmental Stewardship and Action Committee Advisory Committee. So he's very involved in the environmental movement as well as particularly focusing on birds. And Brendon is going to speak to us about the dangers that are inherent in not acting. And he's also going to give us somewhat of a youth perspective. So thank you, Brendon. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here and to see folks taking an interest in our municipal budget. You guys are doing your civic duty. We are living in times when a lot of people are disengaged from politics. It's become very polarized. It's become quite negative, and yet there's a lot of crises happening in our backyard. The only way those crises get addressed is when we come together and we focus on solutions and we prioritize. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that prioritization. Thinking beyond our immediate needs, which I think we're hearing a lot about nowadays to do with safety and homelessness, towards some of the longer term stuff that frankly my generation is going to inherit and have to deal with. And so when I do environmental advocacy work in the city, I'm always trying to balance between the short term and the long term. And so I appreciate you sharing a couple minutes of your time to hear me out and hear about the things that we've been pushing for in the multi-year budget. So if you have been like me following what's going on in London for the last few years, you'll know that we have a climate emergency action plan, and staff have spent a lot of time developing this framework. I've spent a lot of time looking at it. It's pretty good. It's pretty robust. It's not perfect, but I think it's where we need to be headed. And a really important priority I see in our current multi-year budget cycle is now we have to implement it. We haven't actually put any money really towards this since this plan was developed a few years ago. In order for this to actually be effective at influencing city policies and the way that our city is growing quickly, we need to resource this correctly. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about aspects of the climate emergency action plan that I think are really important. This is all kind of packaged together in the budget. I'm going to pull out a couple of elements and use some lingo from the climate action world. So there's some really important graphs in the latest progress report, which, by the way, is available on this website. Get involved at london.ca/climate. Pretty much everything you need to know about the Climate Emergency Action Plan on an ongoing basis is posted here. And they posted a progress report earlier in May last year, talking about how we are doing, data collected over the year 2022. And I pulled out a couple of graphs from that report because I think they're really important for what I want to talk about. So here's our corporate emissions. So if you're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, which are driving the climate crisis and fueling global warming, the city has broken them down into kind of two categories. One is corporate, so it's the city's own operations. That's like city employees driving around city vehicles. That's city buildings and the energy required to heat them in the winter, that sort of thing. And you can see the city's actually doing pretty well. Compared to their corporate targets, our emissions are dropping. They are on track. On the other hand, we have a graph showing emissions reductions from community. So that's the emissions reductions that are happening outside of the corporation of the city. It's folks like you and me, it's businesses in London, it's everything that we do in the city that doesn't involve the local government per se. And this is where I think we should be really concerned. We are not really on track. We've got our milestones shown in green, and we are above them. Now, granted, there was a pandemic. There were extenuating circumstances. This stuff is brand new. It's scary. There's a housing crisis. There's a lot else going on. But the writing is on the wall. The emissions need to come down if we're going to meet our science-based targets and limit global warming to an extent that we are actually able to survive on the planet along with everything else that lives here. Recognizing, of course, that London is not driving the climate crisis at a global scale, we are definitely contributing to it. And if we don't get with the times and adopt new technologies as they're changing, then we're going to be stuck paying more. In fact, we're going to end up using technologies that are outdated and much more costly, like gas infrastructure. There's not that much gas left on the planet, folks, so we probably should be thinking about switching to alternatives before that gets prohibitively costly. And so how do we bring down these community emissions? That's really complicated. It's something that my advisory committee looks at. It's something I see reflected in a lot of the business cases related to the Climate Emergency Action Plan. And I think mitigation of climate change is a really important priority for us, for my generation, and for current people alive today. If you look at where our emissions are coming from in community, we've got pretty good data. This isn't the most current. I think these were produced in 2019, but clearly we've got a problem stemming from the use of personal vehicles in London, and emissions associated with fossil fuel combustion for heating and cooling our homes. These are legacy problems. These are things we've been doing for a long time, so long as these technologies have existed. But we have to come up with alternatives, and the solutions exist, but there are barriers in place that are keeping us from adopting them. In particular, if you don't have an alternative to using your car to get around, then you're going to keep using your car. And if the bus doesn't come on time and you don't have reliable service taking you where you need to go, then people are going to resort to the more convenient option. Similarly, I'm looking at retrofitting my home. I'm a low income household. There are a lot of people in London who might be sympathetic and who might realize their energy bill is a lot higher than it needs to be, but they can't access loans and funding to do that on their own. And to be honest, the provincial government and the federal government, although they have historically been players in that space, they have not really been consistent about those incentives being available moving forward. And so looking at the business case for funding opportunities for low-income households to be able to undertake climate action at home and do energy retrofits and that sort of thing, that might be the last chance that Londoners have to access those supports if they can't otherwise afford them on their own. Here's just a breakdown of some of those common sources of emissions. Again, vehicle gasoline is a really big one. This is another figure that was produced for the Climate Emergency Action Plan. This is an idea of how we should expect our weather to change by the year 2050. And there's a lot of assumptions and contingencies baked into this. Of course, we don't know exactly how much warming will occur. We don't know what's going to happen when the permafrost melts. There's a lot of moving parts to this, but we can see this is going to be pretty scary. We're going to have more extreme weather. We're going to have a lot more water to deal with. We're going to have extreme heat. This is coming, folks. We're already experiencing it today. And so we need to kind of get our affairs in order so that we can limit some of the harms that are coming. The province, despite not being very active on climate change, has actually been publishing information. The Financial Accountability Office of Ontario, if you still believe in financial accountability in Ontario, publishes reports going back a few years. This is the summary, kind of the collation of all of those. And I pulled out just a couple of slides from there because I think it illustrates why we need to be thinking not only about mitigation, so reducing the contributions to warming, like greenhouse gas emissions or methane. We also need to think about adaptation. So if warming is happening, if the climate is changing already, how do we adapt? How do we prepare for some of those extreme conditions I showed you a moment ago? And we know that the option of doing nothing is the most expensive option. We know that as the climate is changing and things are getting warmer and the weather is getting weirder, we should expect that the cost of maintaining our infrastructure is going to go up no matter what. We can limit how much it goes up by taking a proactive approach now. In fact, if we take no action, the FAO estimates that the costs to provincial infrastructure, which by the way we pay for with our taxes, will be $4.1 billion not too long from now. That's costs that my generation will inherit. If we take a proactive adaptation approach, if we start thinking about ways to limit those harms, we can reduce that amount by $1.1 billion per year. That means we're saving $1.1 billion doing the things that we're going to have to do eventually anyway by starting on that sooner. This is consistent with a report that was published last year by the province, the Climate Change Impact Assessment Technical Report. And this is a really comprehensive document. It's a really scary document. It has a lot of sections that talk about various impacts to different sectors. I pulled out a summary table that I think illustrates why we need to be thinking about this in very broad, high-level terms. You can see that the cells in red and orange are rated as very high and high risk, and they've broken it down even by regions. We're looking at pretty significant impacts to the natural environment. They're already happening in some areas, like fauna, for example, in southwestern Ontario is currently rated as high risk because of climate change. That means the animals that exist around us right now are in trouble. That's going up to very high risk by 2050. Similarly, if you look down to the people in community areas of focus, there's going to be high risk for population, high risk for healthcare, high risk for Indigenous communities and social assistance. This is quite scary. There's even impacts to our food system. And so how do we reconcile all this in something like a municipal budget for the near term? I think we need to think about adaptation and the way that some of the things we can do to help with adaptation will check off multiple boxes and help in a bunch of these different areas. And so this is the lens I take when I look at the multi-year budget and the business cases. I also want to point you to this document as a reference that came out last year. It's published by a group called Living Cities Canada, which partnered with the London Environmental Network. And the scope of this report is looking at green infrastructure. So that's the kinds of infrastructure that we can adopt using nature-based solutions to limit some of the harms associated with climate change, both in terms of adaptation and in terms of mitigation and all the other co-benefits for human health and well-being. This report has a lot of really interesting tidbits in it. I'll paste a link into the chat when I'm done if you want to check it out. For example, there are maps in here which show where we've lost vegetative cover in the city, where the city gets really hot on extremely warm days, and where we have the greatest flood risk in the city. And this is, I think, a roadmap for where we might want to target some of that mitigation and adaptation work. It also provides a breakdown assessment of how we're doing in different areas that are scored in the report, ranging from gray, which is not so hot, to green, which means we're doing really well. And so I'm just going to show it to you really quickly, but you can look this up afterwards and read more about it. In terms of equity, we're not doing that great. When we're thinking about natural infrastructure, this is not really prioritizing where people are the most vulnerable in our city. We're not advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples through our approach to green infrastructure. In terms of the abundance and where this is happening, we're about in the middle. We're kind of on our way to doing more of this work. And I think through the Climate Emergency Action Plan, if it is funded through the budget, we will make more progress here. There's other indicators here that I'm not going to get into, but again, I would encourage you to look up this report if you're thinking about which business cases to support. This talks about some of the intersections with our parks and forestry operations and that sort of thing. They talk about thriving, so what it means for us to thrive in the City of London and in terms of the benefits that it provides to people, those co-benefits like reducing extreme heat or improving quality of living. And there's even a summary. So it breaks down at a very high level things that London should be doing, recommendations moving forward for green infrastructure. I think a lot of these are captured by the business cases that are focusing on the Climate Emergency Action Plan and focusing on protecting the natural heritage system. Our environmentally significant areas, for example, those are great examples of green infrastructure that we already have that we're not taking care of properly because we don't resource the management by the UTRCA with enough people and enough funding. Anyways, that's sort of the lens that I take in thinking about climate change adaptation and mitigation. The cost of doing nothing is a lot higher. I think for us, recognizing we've got a lot of acute, important needs right now, we need to strike the right balance between addressing those immediate needs and also planning ahead, where the return on investment might not be something that we feel tomorrow or this year or even in our lifetimes, but will be really, really important for the future of our city. And that's all I've got. Thank you.